7, yeah, I thought it was 8.
Okay, 8.
I read 8.
8. We're actually skipping, we're in Daniel for those of you who are wondering. We're going back to that. We're skipping chapter 7 for now. We're going to come back and tackle chapter 7 in a few weeks. We're going to get chapter 8 and then chapter 9 of Daniel, and then we'll go back to Revelation. And the reason for that, beginning with chapter 6 of Revelation, the scene that we have from that point forward is the tribulation period here on earth. John just skipped straight from the scene in heaven to then the scene on earth as the tribulation begins. But the reason we're skipping at this point and going back to Daniel, John does not give us any information about just when does the tribulation begin. He presents the imagery of what's going on and the details of, all the judgments that are being poured out, but he doesn't give us any information about, well, when does that happen? All we have is a sequence of events. The problem with the sequence is he doesn't tell us when the fuse gets lit. That's why we're going back to the book of Daniel. Daniel chapters 8 and 9 give us the details about the Antichrist, the beginning of all of this, and then later on, as we study the rise again of a renewed Roman Empire, and Alex, we'll get more into that because you're thinking with the Roman Empire, that was like, 2,000 years ago. The Bible tells us that the Roman Empire will rise again, or at least a semblance of that, during the tribulation period. And that will be one of the things that will actually tell us that the world is in the tribulation. It's when we see that empire come to fruition again. That's what Daniel chapter 7 talks about. So we're skipping 7 for now, coming back to that a little later on. So if you're keeping track of what we've covered, don't think we're skipping anything. We're just not taking it in chronological order at this particular point, or as far as the book of Daniel is concerned. So Daniel chapter 8 is where we are going back to. And as we get into this, we're going to be studying a lot of earth history, a lot of what you may recall. Again, I realize it's been probably a few months ago when the last time you took a course on world history. I hear some snickers going on. And what I'm not hearing, but I am hearing, is a yeah, right. But yes, so we're going to be looking at some world history. And the reason this is important is what we're going to see in Daniel is one of these issues, and I know I've explained this to you before, dual fulfillment, where basically an event that Daniel prophesies is going to happen twice. The first time, and the first thing we'll look at, is how it was fulfilled, not specifically in Daniel's time, but in that general era. It was a few hundred years after Daniel. But there's still a few details that did not get fulfilled that points us to the tribulation period, when we will see the ultimate fulfillment. Now, what that boils down to, and what we're talking about, is not just the tribulation, but the Antichrist. Before we get in,
That's the part that I found confusing when I read this yesterday. That it seemed to me that a lot of what was described in this already happened.
it did, and it's going to happen again. Now, does that explain the confusion?
Yeah, a little bit.
All right.
What chapter in Daniel are we looking at?
8. All right. Now, before we get into chapter 8, let me kind of set the scene for you. Ultimately, what we are looking at is the rise of the Antichrist himself. Who is the Antichrist? Now, when I say who, I can, as we'll continue on, going to give you some characteristics of him, some details about where he possibly will come from, some of the things that if we were on the earth, and I'm telling you now, I don't think we will be, so this is theoretical from our perspective, but if we were on the earth, how we would know, okay, that's the Antichrist because he fulfills these characteristics. But am I going to give you a name and a face? No, that's not happening. In fact, the Apostle Paul made that very clear, because what did we just study last week in 2 Thessalonians about the rise of the Antichrist and the church? Does anybody remember?
False prophets.
The people thought they had already happened and they missed it, and that they figured that there was nothing to work for or be vigilant of anymore, and he was trying to explain to them that they hadn't missed it, that it was still coming.
The church is out before the Antichrist comes in.
There you go. You're both right, but you hit it on the head here, Bruce.
What did he say?
Is
The church is out of here before the Antichrist
we
comes.
can, we, the church, will not see or know specifically who the Antichrist is, because one of the things Paul made very clear, the Antichrist cannot come to power, or he actually, what Paul said is he will not be revealed until the church is gone. Now we can point our finger at somebody and say, well, I think that's probably him, or this person, certainly seems like he could be. And to tell you the truth, I think it's entirely possible the Antichrist may be alive and well on the earth now. But if somebody pops up, or you see something on the news that says, this guy's the Antichrist,
Well, they've been doing that for a long time.
Yeah.
I know somebody.
And it's
once
going to
said
continue.
George Bush was the
Donald
Antichrist. Yes,
Yeah.
Donald, yeah, he's been.
No, he's Hitler.
and people have even tried to say that the Pope was the Antichrist. By the way, we're not going to get into it tonight, but I will even show you one of the, and I realize it's kind of a number trick, but whoever thought this one up actually put a lot of thought into it. And there is some evidence that the Pope could be, or not the Pope currently, but some Pope could be the Antichrist. Personally, I don't think that's the case, but I will show you one of these little things that people have been, claiming for years to try to point the finger at the Catholic Church. One thing we need to keep in mind is there are, in fact, a lot of potential candidates out there, because the Apostle John tells us that while the Antichrist may not yet have been revealed, there is one thing. John actually uses these words, says the spirit of Antichrist is already at work. John specifically states that. So is it possible there could be Antichrist with a kind of a little c? Absolutely. But the Antichrist, not yet. Now, having said that, chapter 8 of Daniel. In the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously. By the way, that one he appeared to him previously, that's in chapter 7, and that's the rise of the Roman Empire, which again, we'll come back and grab that later on. Now, you'll notice it says in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar. Now, from our earlier study of Daniel, what happened during the reign of Belshazzar? Does anybody remember?
He basically lost the kingdom to the Median and the Persians.
There you go. In fact, as Daniel describes this particular vision, this vision apparently happened just before the fall of the Babylonian Empire, because Belshazzar was the one who was having the big party when the handwriting was on the wall. All right, it says, and I looked in the vision, And it came about while I was looking that I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam. And I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai Canal. Some of your translations may say the Ulai River. Same thing. Susa is 400 miles, 400 miles from Babylon. Now, there are some people that claim that Daniel saw himself in a vision at Susa. Others say that Daniel had this vision when he was physically at Susa. Does it matter which way we decide to interpret it?
No.
It's irrelevant. The fact is, Daniel is setting the vision at Susa. Whether he was there physically or simply in spirit, it doesn't matter. But here's why Susa is important. When the Babylonians fell to the Medo-Persians, they set their capital up at, anybody want to guess? Susa. They didn't put their capital in Babylon. They destroyed the city of Babylon and put their capital in Susa. So that tells Daniel right here what's coming when he finds himself there, that something to do with Susa is going to occur. Verse 3 says, "Then I lifted my gaze and looked, and behold, a ram which had 2 horns was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. And I saw the ram butting westward, northward, and southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power. But he did as he pleased and magnified himself." Now, I'm going to go ahead and give you a heads up, because I'm going to tell you now what Daniel is actually going to tell us himself in a few verses. The meaning of this ram and why it has 2 horns and one's bigger than the other. It represents the Medo-Persian Empire. And as any knowledgeable historian will tell you, the Medians, that's where the term Medo-Persian Empire, the Medians actually came to power first. But then later on, they merged with the Persian Empire. So the Medians were first. That's the horn that came up first. And then when the Persians joined forces with them, very quickly, the Persians sort of overshadowed the Medians. It continued to be a unified empire where they had an alliance with each other. They weren't, one did not conquer the other. They actually merged as an empire. But the Persians, who came up later, were actually by far the more powerful of the two. And that's why Daniel is telling us that the second horn that came up later was the bigger horn. Now, this is verse 5. "While I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes." Now, I can tell you now, and I probably should spend a little time explaining this. Every time, and this is one of the reasons why we're studying Daniel alongside, and in fact first before we get into Revelation. Every time we have a reference in the Bible to an animal, or what the Bible refers to as a beast, it actually has a prophetic meaning that it represents a kingdom. So keep that in mind. A beast in prophecy is a kingdom. Everybody got that? Now, notice Daniel has just told us, even though he hasn't explained it yet, that this first beast, the Medo-Persian Empire, is very powerful. That he conquered everywhere to the west, to the north, to the south. He doesn't say anything about the east because it was known that the Medo-Persians never advanced very far eastward. And as he's standing there, he sees this other ram coming so fast that his feet weren't even touching the ground. And that's actually what you need to get from this. The reason his feet weren't on the ground is This ram was essentially flying. And what do we know that fulfills this characteristic, or what empire? Does anybody know that came up not too long after that?
Alexander the Great.
Alexander the Great. He conquered all of the known world faster than any other empire had ever taken over. Everybody out!
General
They're
quarters.
coming fast.
What's that?
They're coming fast.
Yeah. All right. Alexander the Great, he conquered everything, everywhere. And in fact, by the time he got done, unlike the Medo-Persians, Alexander's empire stretched all the way to India. And he did it in just about 3 or 4 years. Fastest any king had ever conquered that much territory. Alexander the Great was an absolutely brilliant general as far as a military leader.
And he was like in his 20s, right?
He was. And by the way, one thing that's important to keep in mind about Alexander, he is known to have had 2 sons. However, both of those 2 sons were murdered. So, when I say that Alexander, when he died, had no heir, that's why. He did have sons, but he had no heir because his 2 sons were killed before him. They were both murdered. And the fact that Alexander died without an heir is very important to understanding what is about to happen that Daniel is prophesying about. Verse 6, it says, he came up to the ram that had the 2 horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. And I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him. And he struck the ram and shattered his 2 horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. By the way, the reason he came at him with such rage, it is known that one of the reasons Alexander was so bent on destroying the Medo-Persian Empire is the Medo-Persians, or the Medians, had invaded Greece a generation earlier. They killed a lot of people. They caused Alexander's family. Of course, anybody remember who Alexander's father was?
Philip.
Philip of Macedon, absolutely. And Philip of Macedon was the one who unified all of Greece, because at that time Greece was just a loose confederation of city-states. There was no Greek country. They had a common language, common culture to some extent, but they did not have a common government or country. Philip of Macedon solved that problem by military might. But one of the things that Philip is reported to have told his young son Alexander was, Macedonia is not big enough for you. You need to find something, that's big enough for your level of intelligence and military expertise. And that's what prompted Alexander the Great to decide to conquer everything.
Philip built the army that Alexander used.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. But in the process, one of the things that Alexander was brought up with was a hatred of the Medo-Persians because of their conquering of Greece a couple of generations earlier. He had no love lost for them at all. And so when he came in, he absolutely devastated the Medo-Persian Empire. So now we have a Babylonian Empire that has now collapsed, a Medo-Persian Empire that has now collapsed, and now comes on the scene the Greek Empire. By the way, this is all important as well because we get back to chapter 7. Guess what we're going to see in that? Empires coming and going. Chapter 7 actually talks about 4 empires. Everybody want to know what the 4th one is?
Rome.
The Roman Empire, which we'll get to that later on. All right. Remainder of verse 7 says, so he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly. But as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. Now, what this means is that at the very height of his career, Alexander had conquered all of the known world as far east as India, far north up into what is now Russia, southward to Egypt, westward all the way to the what is now the British Empire. There, as far as Alexander's concerned, there wasn't much else left to conquer. Now, granted, Alexander probably could have continued on all the way to the Pacific Ocean, but by this point, his army was absolutely exhausted. By the time he conquered India, his army pretty much started to rebel on him and told him that we're not going on any further. Because we've been away from our families for several years. We want to go home. We've done what you ask of us. We're tired.
Did he commit suicide?
Not exactly. But that is what Daniel's getting at when he says, as soon as he was, this is verse 8, as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken. What happened, he did not commit suicide, but in a drunken stupor, basically he got sick and died. It's not believed that he intentionally killed himself, but he pretty much died because of his drunkenness, his alcoholism, and the fact that he, he drank himself into an early grave, because by this point he conquered everything there was to conquer. And what does a conqueror do when there's nothing else left to conquer?
Bored.
He gets bored, get drunk.
Wasn't he also believed to be an epileptic?
I hadn't heard that one.
Syphilis.
He's probably right-handed too.
I think they said he cried when there was no more worlds to conquer.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned earlier, by about this time, his two sons had already been murdered. And as he died in a drunken stupor, he had no heir to take over for him. So his kingdom got divided up into, anybody want to guess how many parts? 4 parts. Alexander had four main generals that served him. They divided the empire into those 4 parts, and each general took a different section of it. One of those generals that ended up in the southeastern quadrant of the Greek Empire ended up inheriting, if you want to call it that, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, that general area. And that is the area that we need to pay most, close attention to. Daniel refers to what's going to come as the abomination of desolation. And here's the dual fulfillment part. Christ, said that there was going to come a time when the temple itself would be desecrated, that there would be an abomination that would make the temple desolate, or the abomination of desolation. Christ spoke of that. He was referring to the Antichrist. When Daniel tells us about this, Daniel's actually talking about 2 abominations that make desolate. The first one was one of these Greek generals. The second one, of course, is the Antichrist. So when you said you saw some things that looked like they had been fulfilled then, that's the first time it happened. Second time hasn't happened yet. All right. Let's continue on verse 9. And out of one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. Of course, the beautiful land is Daniel's poetic way of describing, anybody want to guess? Israel, absolutely. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and caused some of the hosts and some of the stars to fall to the earth, and it trampled them down. Now, clearly, this general, and by the way, I'm going to give you his name now, so I don't have to just get referring to him as this general. And by the way, the general that I'm about to tell you about is not one of the 4 generals. He actually, I'm not going to get into the names of all of these guys. because I don't think you really care about, how many of you want to know the name of every one of these generals?
Meryl does.
I was trying to just be good. I already know the name of at least one.
Seleucid. Probably Seleucid?
Ptolemy.
Okay, Ptolemy. Anyway, it was the general that succeeded that general is the one that's important. I'm not going to get into every single detail of the history involved in this, because that's not what we're here to study tonight. We're here to try to figure out all about the Antichrist. So I'm going to give you basically what you need to know to follow along all this and leave out some of the unnecessary details. So if as I share this, you're saying, well, wait a minute, that wasn't his name, or that came later, you'll understand why I'm not giving you all the details. Now, Antiochus was his name. Guess which city got named after him? Antioch. Absolutely. That's where the name Antioch came from. Antiochus. His name was Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes, his name was Antiochus. Epiphanes is a Greek title that means God manifest. In other words, this is a title that Antiochus gave himself, and he declared that I'm God. And he literally had his generals go around all, in Egypt, Israel, Syria, everywhere that he was in control of, and would literally require them to fall down and worship an idol of him. And if they didn't, well, it cost them their head. He actually had his military personnel go from city to city, rounding up all the city people, especially the leaders. Any one of the city leaders that would not declare that Antiochus was indeed God, well, he didn't survive the day. Well, one of the things that he did later on was to go into the temple in Jerusalem, kicked over the altar, had his military personnel come into the Holy of Holies, which of course the fact that he had walked into the Holy of Holies desecrated the temple. He goes in there, kicks over the altar, has his people come in and set up a pagan altar and sacrificed a pig on it. And then took the blood of that pig and sprayed it all over the entire temple. That's what is referred to as the abomination that desolated the temple. Antiochus Epiphanes is the abomination of desolation, the first one.
And didn't he go to Israel and he was friendly with them, and then he went to Egypt and conquered Egypt, and basically coming back?
I would not say he was never friendly with them.
Right.
Antiochus Epiphanes hated the Jews.
Right. He acted like he was theirs.
He might have from time to time to get whatever he wanted, but was he friendly? No. He hated them. And they hated him. And in fact, that's where the Jews referred to him as Antiochus Epimanes, which Epimanes was a word that meant madman. Instead of Antiochus God manifest, they referred to him as Antiochus the madman. Well, he is this fourth little horn, the little general that came up after Alexander the Great's death. And as I mentioned, he absolutely hated the Jews. Did everything he could to force the Jews to abandon their worship. In fact, a couple of the things that edicts that he issued, he said that any Jewish parent caught circumcising their young male child, that their boy would be sacrificed on a pagan altar, alive no less, and he was known for burning children alive, and that the parents would be required to watch as their child burned to death, and then the parents would be executed.
Nice guy.
Anybody who was caught observing Jewish festivals or going to the temple to worship, they were executed. It was his goal to absolutely stamp out Jewish worship. He hated the Jews that much. Now let's get back to our passage of scripture here.
What does it mean that it says, grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall?
Okay. Now that particular part, I was going to come back to that, but I'll go ahead and tackle it now.
What verse?
Remember, that's
10.
verse 10. Now, you remember that parts of this have a dual fulfillment? That's part of it that hasn't been fulfilled yet. That will be fulfilled by the Antichrist himself, because as you read that, what does that, I mean, just use your common sense. What does that sound like? Who would cause the stars of heaven to fall?
That'd be Satan.
Satan. That's a verse pointing the finger at Satan, at the future Antichrist. What he did, that doesn't apply to him.
Okay.
That's Satan. And of course, anybody that does what I've described this guy as being, who's probably the spirit behind that's pulling his strings? Satan. All right,
So
verse 11.
He was one of the many antichrists, not the big one.
Right.
I've heard that from somebody that Satan's got to have an Antichrist ready because he really doesn't know when his real Antichrist is going to be able to really take control of things. Does that sound?
That's possible. However, I look at it from this perspective. When the time comes and Satan finds himself in control as the leader of the world, how long do you think it would take him to possess somebody to become the Antichrist?
Not too long.
Not too long at all. Verse 11. It being the little horn, could say it even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host, and it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. Now verse 11 is going to be fulfilled by both Antiochus Epiphanes and the Antichrist. Because one thing that Antiochus Epiphanes declared was that, well, as the name Epiphanes means, he claimed that he was God and demanded that he be worshipped as God. In the future, when the Antichrist comes on the scene, what's he going to do that's any different than that? He's going to do the same thing. He's going to claim that he's God and demand that people worship him. And when it talks about that he claims to be equal with the commander of the host, well, who's commander of the host?
Christ.
Christ. Absolutely. That's a title of Christ. Verse 12 says, and on account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. In other words, both what Antiochus Epiphanes did and what the Antichrist will do. They're going to deceive people. They're going to basically deny the truth of the gospel. Before Christ, during the time that Antiochus Epiphanes was in command there, he demanded that they stop worshiping, that true worship be abolished, that they worship him. And in the time to come, the Antichrist is going to do exactly the same thing. He's going to demand that no Christian, be allowed to live, that no one worship this, Jesus, that they worship him because he's God. So what you see is a direct parallel between what Antiochus Epiphanes did and what the Antichrist is going to do. Verse 13 says, then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one. Of course, this is a holy one is a reference to an angel. And another holy one speaking to that particular one who was speaking, how long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply while the transgression causes horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled? And he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be restored. So what he's saying is, essentially, if you divide this up, there's two possible ways. 2,000 evenings and mornings could be poetic for saying 2,300 days, which is a little more than 6 years. Other commentators have said, well, no, that's 2,300 evenings and mornings. So in other words, would have been half that number, because you add up the evenings and the mornings, so you take 2,300 and divide by 2. What was actually the case? Probably the first, the evenings and mornings together, 2,300 days, because the amount of time that Antiochus Epiphanes ruled was about 6 years.
Are there some interpretations that say that's 2,300 years?
No. That would be, well, if it was 2,300 years, we would only just now be coming up to the end of it.
Well, I thought I heard something about people using that to interpret when the Antichrist is coming and when the end times come. 2,300 years from the time of that prophecy.
Yeah, but notice what it says here. It doesn't say that. It says, how long will this go on? And then the angel tells Daniel, says, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored. He's saying how long the abomination is going to last, not how long it's going to take for it to start.
Okay, and when I read this yesterday, I saw that as being almost 7 years, so I wondered if that foretold the tribulation.
I don't think so, because later on, as we get into the tribulation, Daniel actually is very specific later on as to how long the tribulation is. I mean, right down to the day, and it is right at 7 years, whereas 2,300 days is about 6 years and 3 months.
Now, when it says the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state, was that the Maccabees?
Yes, and we are going to have a nice little history lesson on who the Maccabees are. I'll give you just a quick heads up, since it's after 6 now, what we're going to look at Sunday evening. As Bruce just mentioned, there's a group called, they're referred to as the Maccabees. You're not going to find them in your Bible unless you're reading a Catholic Bible or reading the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Maccabees, primarily 1st and 2nd Maccabees, that you'll find in what's called the Apocrypha. It is a group of people that rebelled against the Greek Empire. And the reason this is important for us, even though it's, not in your regular Bible, is a study of the Maccabees and the Maccabean history will tell us how we, as God's people, get from Malachi, and you flip over a few pages to Matthew, and lo and behold, we're in the middle of the Roman Empire, and you wonder, how did we get from Malachi to Matthew? What happened? Well, the history that we find in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Maccabees tells us that, and so we're going to have a little history lesson about who the Maccabees are and how the Roman Empire came to fruition in Israel. Not going to look at the Roman Empire, how, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire. We're not looking at that. That'd be a college course all by itself. We're just looking at how did the Romans come to be in Israel and what happened to this guy. And that's what we're going to look at. Now, the reason all of that is important for, how's that affect the Antichrist? This most important issue. When Daniel tells us about the abomination of desolation, he rolls those two, as you've already seen, he rolls those two prophecies together. Because the temple, from his perspective and the vision that he was seeing, came under desolation twice. Once, just about 100 years after his lifetime, and then it's going to happen again in the temple which hasn't yet been built in Israel during the tribulation period. And if you don't understand the history between the two, it gets very difficult to figure out which passage is talking about which event. And also the one thing that probably, I'm sure many of you have already seen, or at least come to this conclusion, just about every single event, especially prophetically speaking, that happens in the New Testament has got some kind of precedent in the Old Testament. Every single one of them.
Are you going to talk about Matthew 24? Because I get confused with that relative to if he's talking about the 70 AD temple being demolished, or if he's talking about, because he says it's going to come in that his generation, and that always.
I'm guessing that was probably when you were out of town.
Yeah.
Okay, that probably was that. I apologize.
I was just thinking we studied that already.
Yep.
Okay.
What I would suggest,
I'll go look at the.
I actually uploaded a video about that very
Yeah,
issue.
good, I'm glad. Okay, because that one's always
Because that would have been about, probably, I'm guessing, about 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago.
Yep.
Yeah. Hopefully I can get some time to catch it up.
All right. Questions this evening? All right. Mario.